The Synchro Mystic presents Synchro Mystique. On a list of power places in the United States, one that would take us from the ancient earthenworks at Serpent Mound in Ohio through the stainless steel Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri, to the American New Age capital of Sedona, Arizona, we would certainly mention the Four Corners. Every year, more than 250,000 tourists travel U.S. Route 160 to visit the monument that is routinely, if blandly, described as the only place in the United States where four states meet. Of course, the reference is to the supposed point of intersection among Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. Like many other national monuments, the early history of the Four Corners marker is a fluid tale. However, it's worth noting that next year, as of this writing, 2025, will likely be commemorated as the 150th anniversary of the erection of the sandstone shaft installed at the Four Corners by the United States General Land Office surveyor Chandler Robbins in 1875. This date, although it could be disputed as the correct one, was previously cited during the 125th anniversary back in the year 2000. Once upon a time, the Four Corners area was explored as the possible site of the fabled Seven Cities of Cibola, which I discussed in a recent brief video. Indeed, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, leader of the second search for the Seven Cities, traveled very near the mythical Four Corners country. Here, Indians known as the Anasazi, more on which shortly, held sway for hundreds of years, until their mysterious disappearance in the 13th and 14th centuries. For more on the Seven Cities of Gold, see the past presentation. Coincidentally or not, the Four Corners area is surrounded by lands that are still sacred to both the Navajo and Hopi American Indian nations. The area is associated with numerous curious oddities, such as severe storms that hit without warning due to a long-standing weather radar blind spot, and other anomalies. What's all the fuss about? First, however, we should probably tackle head-on the perennial allegation that the Four Corners marker doesn't actually sit in the right place. As disclosed in press reports some years back, and as some intrepid Google Map users have reported, the gist of this charge is that the four-state intersection was imprecisely surveyed. Interestingly, the worry comes in two forms, with some criticizing the monument makers for a major blunder, and others merely cautioning about a more or less minor error. The former version goes something like this: the Four Corners monument is off by as much as 2.5 miles. But before we sharpen the pencils on our compasses or break out our yardsticks, we should probably keep the following in mind. According to online summaries of the monument's history and defenses of its accuracy, in 1863 the U.S. Congress decreed that the divide between the Arizona and New Mexico territories should be coincident with the 32nd meridian of longitude west of the Washington, D.C. meridian. Washington, D.C. is located on the 77th meridian, or line of longitude. So the starting point for this version of the complaint may be the belief that the location of Four Corners was supposed to have been along the 109-degree line of west longitude. But it isn't. At least, not exactly. It's at 109.04517 degrees west. And this deviation translates to 2+ miles. That's the argument. However, the U.S. National Geodetic Survey, or NGS, replies that this reasoning is based on an incorrect assumption. According to the NGS, the reference meridian was the one that would have bisected the dome of the old Naval Observatory, namely 77 degrees 3 minutes west. Therefore, the answer to the major blunder, folks, is to point out that the boundary line should not be expected to be found at precisely 109 degrees. But even this adjusted value leads to the modified complaint. The more modest objection is based on the fact that the relevant surveying, which was conducted between 1868 and 1875, just wasn't as pinpoint accurate as what we can establish today in the wake of satellites and personal computers. Here, the NGS admits that there is a little something to the naysayers' claims. For even if the 19th century surveyor, the previously named Chandler Robbins, was aiming at 109 degrees 3 minutes, or, to be precise, 109 degrees 2 minutes 59.25 seconds, he still missed. Once again, we can see this by turning to Wikipedia, which shows, evidently accurately, that the present Four Corners brass plate lies along 109 degrees 2 minutes 42.612 seconds west. The difference between 2 minutes 59.25 seconds and 2 minutes 42.612 seconds is enough to put the actual monument around 1,800 feet to the east of where it was intended to be, or in some reports 1,807.14 feet. Still with us? What's the big deal? Well, there are two sides to that coin. Turning again to the NGS, one writer declares that although the present monument deviates from the exact coordinates Robbins was angling towards, nonetheless, the location has been accepted as is by the states involved. In other words, the surveying, as it was actually done by Robbins and others of the period, was adopted as the de jure boundary between the Arizona and New Mexico territories, and eventually the states of Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. From a legal standpoint, then, the deviation is purely a theoretical, academic matter and only has historical interest. But surely, if there's a counterpoint, it would be something like this. Insofar as the intended coordinates were calibrated with respect to the Washington, D.C. meridian, we might suspect that the monument's planned location was selected with an eye toward what we might call number magic. If this is tenable, then extending our hypothesis and setting aside the possibility of mundane boundary disputes, we might suspect that the real magnetism lies elsewhere. Because, as the Warner Brothers cartoon character Foghorn Leghorn once memorably exclaimed, "Figures don't lie," and that launches us headlong into an exploration that is presumably more abstract than anything you could photograph along Highway 160. The mystical side of numbers and mathematics arguably goes back to Pythagoras, whom we profiled in a dedicated video, and included in our list of the top 10 esoterics of all time. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato was heavily influenced by this current, as is seen, for instance, in his cosmologically oriented dialogue titled The Timaeus. In that work, Plato discussed various regular polyhedrons, now called Platonic solids, even going so far as to associate them with the four basic elements of Empedocles, plus the fabled fifth element, or quintessence, of course. Some of this seems to have inspired the actor Terrence Howard, who recently promoted his wacky, not to say misguided, teriology on the popular internet show The Joe Rogan Experience. Historically, numerology also shows up in the Jewish Kabbalah, or Kabbalah, which includes several arcane alphanumeric manipulations that fly under the banner of gematria and allied disciplines. Much of this bubbled up to the surface during the European Renaissance, when so-called humanists like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin married Pythagorean doctrines and Neoplatonism with a supposedly Christianized version of the Kabbalah. If you're still with me, and we did survey some of this in past videos, this witch's brew leads us to the alchemical laboratory of the Elizabethan magus and mathematician John Dee. Among other wide-ranging interests including astrology and, allegedly, communicating with angels or demons via a technique known as scrying, Dee, who at one time sat at the feet of map innovator Gerardus Mercator, was involved in then cutting-edge developments in cartography and navigation. To make short shrift of a lot of abstruse doctrines, the driving force for Dee, and like-minded occultists, seems to have been the belief that carving up the world into numbers would facilitate both access and control of the globe. In other words, it was in the service of imperialism. And we have concrete historical examples of monuments being set up under astrological direction, quite possibly for magical reasons. For a single European illustration of this, we turn to Dee's contemporary, the Dominican mathematician and astronomer Ignazio Danti. Danti assisted Italian Renaissance architect Domenico Fontana when Catholic Pope Sixtus V commissioned the erection of 4 Egyptian obelisks, including the one still and famously located in St. Peter's Square, in the heart of Vatican City. Mind you, this was no mean feat in the 16th century. Hence, Dante's calculations, whether astrological, geographic, geometric, or what have you, would have been crucial. Back in America, one of, if not the crucial variables here is the claim that Washington, D.C. was purposely constructed along the 77th meridian. Offbeat videographer Christian J. Pinto pursued this line of inquiry for his 2006 documentary, Secret Mysteries of America's Beginnings. In that presentation, Pinto summarized the viewpoint of researcher Duncan Steele. Steele claimed that John Dee had devised a calendar system that depended upon or implicated the 77th meridian, which Steele christened God's longitude. Recall that in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII had officially promulgated a replacement for the calendar that bore the name of Roman Emperor Julius Caesar, with the one that we still call the Gregorian. Steele went so far as to claim that famed 16th century Elizabethan explorer Sir Walter Raleigh figures into this equation. You may immediately recall Raleigh's name in conjunction with the quest for the golden cities of Cibola, which we recently surveyed in a dedicated video. In 1585, Raleigh sponsored the founding of what is now known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke, which he intended to have been the first English colony in America, on an island which is part of present-day North Carolina. One of the key players was John White, who became Roanoke's governor. In 1587, White sailed to England for supplies, leaving about 100 colonists, including his daughter and his new granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. White returned to Roanoke in 1590 to find the island deserted. The single word, Croatoan, was carved on a tree. The colonists were never found. But according to Duncan Steele, Raleigh's true purpose was not to set up a self-sufficient Jamestown-style beachhead. Rather, Roanoke was merely the landing and staging area for a scouting party whose real mission was to plant the English flag along God's meridian. And this was located several miles inland. Professedly Protestant Christians, Englishmen such as Raleigh, had a fascination with the 77th line of longitude, which likely went beyond Dee's astronomical calculations. After all, in the genealogy set forth by St. Luke the Evangelist, there were 77 generations from Adam to Jesus Christ. As the great 4th to 5th century church doctor, St. Augustine of Hippo, pointed out, that same number, 77, is one way to symbolize perfect forgiveness, as seen in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 and 22. In the Old Testament book of Genesis, we read that Lamech invoked the number 77 as a declaration of his all-consuming vengefulness. In fact, some authorities say that all derivatives or multiples of 7 carry with them the idea of wholeness, and not just for Christians. Thus, unsurprisingly, Muslims too seem to esteem the number 77, as seen, for example, in the authoritative traditions known as the Hadith, where the Prophet Muhammad was said to have identified 77 branches of faith. Not to be outdone, infamous late 19th to 20th century British occultist Edward Alexander Aleister Crowley released his declaration on the rights of man under the Latinized title Liber Az, often translated Book 77. You could say that, in the imagination of Crowley and his many admirers, 77 represents what other streams of alt spirituality, including esoteric Freemasonry, have termed the perfected man. Perhaps there's an echo of this in folklore regarding the seventh son of a seventh son. That the potential numerical palindrome also made an appearance in one of the darkest hours in the domestic United States is a fact that didn't go unnoticed by author S.K. Bain. One wonders if this sort of confluence of lucky sevens was on the minds of those Coloradan true believers in manifest destiny who adopted in 1861 the motto, "Nothing without Providence." It's probably just a coincidence that this phrase, in its Latin form, is said to derive from Book 2 of the great 1st century BC Roman poet Virgil's Aeneid, specifically line number 777. Whatever the explanation for its alleged appeal to our founding fathers, according to the aforementioned Pinto, such is the mystique of the 77th line of longitude that Washington, D.C. was founded in part to harness the power of this meridian. If this seems far-fetched, recall that there is still a park in Washington, D.C. called Meridian Hill. Its initial land function was to serve as a marker for a proposed domestic prime meridian line determined from the U.S. Capitol. By the way, stay tuned for our planned exploration of the District of Columbia. A tangent linguistic point comes to us by way of Catholic priest Father Gabriel Amorth, subject of the 2023 movie The Pope's Exorcist, featuring actor Russell Crowe. According to Amorth, writing originally in a 1990 autobiography, which was translated into English 9 years later as An Exorcist Tells His Story, the list of heavyweight demons includes one named Meridian. Of course, meridian, the word, comes from the Latin, where it meant roughly noon. Though with respect to a connection to demonology, recall that Lucifer means light bringer, and that Satan masquerades as an angel of light, according to the New Testament's second letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verse 14 in the Bible. Of course, at this point, we might bring in the extreme weather peculiarities that plague Four Corners, which we teased in our intro. Not least of which is that the Colorado Plateau, which incidentally is within a ring of mountains of volcanic origin, displays very high concentrations of lightning activity. Recall also the radar anomalies which left residents open to blizzards in 1997 and in the year 2013. In 2015, one such mammoth snowstorm closed US 491 from Cortez to Monticello, Utah for 17 hours. Well, what's that got to do with anything? Oh, we haven't mentioned that US 491 used to be numbered Route 666, which is odd in the first place since it is an even number for a north-south roadway. The more conspicuous point, however, is that Highway 666 was nicknamed the Devil's Highway. In the Bible, of course, the book of Revelation says 666 is the number of the beast, usually interpreted as Satan or the Antichrist. For more on that personage, see 10 nameless Bible figures and their secret names. The route number was changed in 2003, as an Associated Press dispatch from that year declared, "It's the apocalypse for Devil's Highway. US 666 gets a less fiendish number." Although, before assuming that 491 is a harmless number, let's turn to Wikipedia. A relevant article summarizes an obscure 1964 Swedish film titled 491, saying, the film's tagline is, "It is written that 490 times you can sin and be forgiven." This motion picture is about the 491st. In speaking of God's meridian, we earlier alluded to the Gospel of Matthew. You'll recall chapter 18, verse 22, where Jesus sets the bar of forgiveness, not at 7 times, but at 77 times, in the phraseology of the New International Version of the Bible at any rate. But the Venerable King James translation renders the same passage, "Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee, until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Not to put too fine a point on it, but 70 times 7 equals 490, which could imply that 491 represents unforgiveness, or is, in a word, every bit as antichrist as 666. Regardless, the foreign film was evidently banned in some Scandinavian countries and in the United Kingdom. But back in the good old US of A, a Devil's Highway? Demonic and divine meridians? And why was the Arizona-New Mexico boundary specified to be offset from the so-called God's longitude by 32 degrees? What gives? We can't say for sure, of course. After all, we're not members of inner sanctum institutions such as Yale University's Skull and Bones, the super-secret fraternity that has populated the federal government since the days of William Howard Taft all the way through George W. Bush. For more on that, by the way, see 10 Occultist Spies. Additionally, we're not invited to the pagan-infused ceremonials of the Bohemian Grove. in the redwood forests of Sonoma County, California, but for more on which see 10 presidents who were members of secret societies. But we can say that the number 32 means more to occultists than designating the average number of teeth in an adult human mouth, or the freezing point of water on the Fahrenheit scale, or even half the number of squares on a chessboard. Though if author David Talbot was onto something, this little throwaway fact might be more penetrating in insight than it may seem at first. For instance, in the Jewish mystical Kabbalah, there are 32 paths of wisdom associated with a diagram known as the Tree of Life. By official count, 32 is the sum of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet plus the 10 divine Sephirot. Let us know in the comments section if you like to see us survey the Kabbalah, like we did Neoplatonism. In any case, this Kabbalistic use of the number may have informed Freemasonry, which counts the 32nd degree as the penultimate in the influential Scottish Rite. Note well that penultimate means next to last and not super ultimate. After all, Freemasonry is replete with Jewish mystical symbolism, including its flagship compass and square, which is reminiscent of an incomplete Star of David. Moreover, Freemasons are fascinated with the lore surrounding Solomon's Temple, and indeed they have a veritable obsession with the prospect of seeing it rebuilt. Finally, some repositories of Masonic ritualism declare that two of the order's ends are the good of Masonry generally, but the good of the Jewish nation in particular. Crucially for our story, Freemasonry and similar fraternal orders were on the rise during Reconstruction, an era we discussed at greater length in our election fraud video. As we explored in presidents who were in secret societies, it's certainly true that Masonry temporarily declined following the disappearance and presumed murder of Captain William Morgan in 1826. In fact, this episode resulted in the formation of one of the first influential third parties in American history, the Anti-Masonic Party. But the anti- and pro-Masonic battle was eclipsed by the war between the North and South, the American Civil War. After that, the craft, as it's sometimes called, once again gained traction. In fact, by the beginning of the 20th century, researchers say that as many as 1/3 of all Americans belonged to a secret society, and there were hundreds of such organizations. Significantly, the federal government was heavily populated with Masons. You can get a sense of this merely by looking at presidential office holders since the Civil War. Andrew Johnson, James Garfield, William McKinley, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, the previously mentioned William Howard Taft, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, better known as FDR, Harry S. Truman, Lyndon Baines Johnson, that is LBJ, and Leslie Lynch King, better known as Gerald R. Ford, are all said to have been card-carrying Masons. Additionally, Ronald Reagan was made an honorary member of Scottish Rite Freemasonry February 11, 1988, and William Jefferson Blythe III, better known as William Jefferson Bill Clinton, belonged to the Order of Demolay, which is a Masonic youth group named after the executed Grand Knight Templar Jacques de Molay. Of course, we got into much more detail on these matters in our Masonic Presidents video, but our point is that the earliest history of the Four Corners Monument coincides with the heyday of American Freemasonry. From 1863, when Congress ordered the above-referenced territorial survey, to 1868, when what we now think of as the marker was initially set, through 1875, when Surveyor Chandler Robbins went about his business. This was the age of Masonry. It shouldn't be at all surprising if Masonic numerology found its way into a congressional decree. A contemporary example of this was House Resolution 33 from 2007. Quote, recognizing the thousands of Freemasons in every state and honoring them for their many contributions, end quote. The number 33 is patently Masonic, as was FDR's introduction of the all-seeing eye and related symbolism to the dollar bill. For more on all these odds and ends, once again see Presidents and Secret Societies, as well as 10 gold-making alchemists. Not only this, but Masons are undeniably fascinated with sacred geometry, or the idea that specific mathematical proportions or relations have symbolic importance or even magical power. In fact, one oft-mentioned possible interpretation of the cryptic letter G, often surrounded by the Masonic compass and square, is that it signifies allegiance to this sort of geometry. Though for an alternative perspective, see our several explorations of Gnosticism. And don't forget that Freemasons extol the virtues of a demigod figure they refer to as the Great Architect of the Universe. It's arguable that these Masonic preoccupations derive from or are motivated by the previously mentioned Jewish gematria, as well as Hermetic maxims such as above, so below. Writers like David Oveson and James Wasserman have put considerable energy into arguing that the Founding Fathers were interested in laying out Washington, D.C. in accordance with these precepts. Even granting this Kabbalistic Masonic numerology, you may still be saying to yourself, yeah, okay, but why the four corners? So let's gesture towards a few of the evidential bits and pieces. Firstly, would you believe that in ruins found in Yellow Jacket Canyon in southwestern Colorado, just north of the Four Corners along the 109th meridian, were ancient plaster walls displaying what one apparently sober-minded archaeologist termed Mason's signs? Admittedly, the prospect of early Amer Indians dressing in Masonic regalia or greeting each other with secret handshakes seems vanishingly slim. Although Freemasons themselves enjoy speculating along these lines. One thinks, for example, of the ancient Egyptian obelisk standing in New York's Central Park, one of two such monuments referred to jointly as Cleopatra's Needles, the other currently located on the Victoria Embankment in London. It was hewn in Heliopolis, or modern-day Cairo, during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III. Despite its antiquity, one writer, sympathetic to Masonry, wrote in 1904 that, quote, "The discovery of Masonic emblems in the foundation steps to the pedestal of the Egyptian obelisk is accepted by many as strong evidence that Freemasonry existed at least a century before Christ." As an aside, sometimes the Luxor obelisk, now standing on the Place de la Concorde in Paris, France, is referred to as a third Cleopatra's Needle. We're not especially inclined to argue against the point, though it is worth mentioning that the Parisian obelisk is itself one of an original pair. Its counterpart evidently remains in the city of Luxor, ancient Thebes, on the east bank of the Nile River. There's also Rudyard Kipling's classic novel, The Man Who Would Be King, memorably brought to the silver screen by director John Huston, and featuring actors Michael Caine, Sean Connery, and Christopher Plummer. The basic story revolves around two British adventurers in India who become kings of Kafiristan, a remote part of Afghanistan. Hopefully, without giving too much of the plot away, let's just say that, in the course of the narrative, Kipling, who was a Mason himself, at one point advances the plot by having his main characters discover that the Kafiris practiced a form of Masonic ritual. In other words, Kipling represents Masonry as ancient and widespread enough to be recognizable in parts of Central Asia that, up to that time, had been virtually untouched by Europeans. Returning to the American Southwest, and, for the moment, setting aside fiction, the Four Corners area undeniably seems to exude synchro mojo, well before and apart from the goings-on in the 37th Congress. For instance, the Four Corners area is the major U.S. hotspot for methane emissions. Recently, researchers from the Boulder, Colorado-based Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known by the acronym NASA, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, brought sophisticated equipment to bear on this issue. According to Christian Frankenberg, a scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Pasadena, California, a small region around the Four Corners had the highest concentration of methane gas over background levels of any part of the United States. On top of this, the surrounding area, including the sprawling Colorado Plateau, is a major source of radioactive uranium. Important, of course, to advance the nation's nuclear ambitions. Stay tuned for a planned synchromystical tour of Los Alamos, New Mexico, home of the Los Alamos National Laboratory and site of the Manhattan Project. Recently dramatized in Hollywood director Christopher Nolan's 2023 film Oppenheimer. The movie, of course, centers around pioneering nuclear physicist Julius Robert Oppenheimer, so-called father of the atomic bomb. And then there are tales of an evidently malign 9-foot-tall, gray-haired monster. Its terrifying growls have disturbed more than one New Mexico family's sleep near the Four Corners. The case would be tempting to file under the heading hallucinations, were it not for allegations of resultant property damage. Photos circulate that allegedly display bite marks and deep, 3-clawed scratches left in structures and vehicles in the path of the unknown creature some have nicknamed the Night Stalker. In short, cryptid aficionados will also find something of interest at the Four Corners. Additionally, astute observers of news and politics, both nationally and internationally, will not be surprised that the now nearly ubiquitous unidentified flying objects, or UFO phenomenon, is also represented at Four Corners, possibly in a big way. For example, according to career military man and so-called UFO whistleblower William Bill Holden, there were many crashes in the Four Corners area. Unfortunately, the topic is both broader and deeper than we can tackle fully here. From necessary work at archives like Mutual UFO Network to the many contrarian theories of astronomer and computer scientist Jacques Vallée, our work will be cut out for us preparing worthwhile reportage to add to the panorama. However, readers can be certain that such further UFO explorations are every bit on the order of the day. Nevertheless, despite the tangle of competing hypotheses and the veritable avalanche of eyewitness reports, we do wish to direct your attention to some of the quasi-mystical insights of the enigmatic Tal Levesque. For you see, the Fortean writer known as Tal or Tal Levesque, who regaled his readership with an oracular style reminiscent of other intuitives like Freemasonic philosopher Manly Palmer Hall and synchromystic godfather James Shelby Downard, also suggested that there is a close connection between the Four Corners and UFO activity of various sorts. According to Levesque, the Four Corners is a veritable treasure trove of UFO crash and contact sites, which overlays its ancient tunnels. Finally, there's offbeat investigators Joan Price and Elizabeth A. Rauscher. In studying the local environmental fields of the Colorado Plateau region, they alleged an abundance of negative air ions at many Indian sacred places, as well as unusually strong positive electrical currents in the ground. One of their most fascinating finds is that, underlying the Four Corners region, there is a labyrinth of caverns which connect with the surface through caves and blowholes. On a hot summer day, wind flows out of these vents at as much as 20 miles per hour, sometimes creating audible whistling noises. At night, as surface temperatures drop, air rushes back into the ground, recharging these pneumatic reservoirs. The whole process is sometimes dubbed the breathing earth. But did you catch the reference to Indian sacred places? And on that note, we introduce, as our final chapter, highlights of a story that, in truth, is much closer to the beginning of things. Remembered as makers of multi-storied cliff dwellings in northwestern New Mexico, the Anasazi were, by some accounting, the greatest builders among the peoples native to North America. They erected huge, semicircular pueblos across the Four Corners area of the Southwest. The summit of their art was Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico's Chaco Canyon. This 10th century complex stood 5 stories tall in parts, its 800 rooms occupying 3 acres. Its thick walls were made of irregular sandstone blocks with modular doorways connecting adjacent rooms and rows of log beams supporting the floors overhead. Arguably, these structures were monuments worthy of the Egyptian pharaohs, with other ancient American civilizations, such as the Mohican, Olmec, and Toltec. The Anasazi buildings were paired with urban public works on a par with the achievements of classical Rome and housed artifacts every bit the match of medieval handicrafts. New World astronomers were no less accomplished, devising calendars that would have been the envy of Renaissance mathematicians, some of whom we've mentioned already. And the priests who spun out the Native American folklore made it every bit as rich and meaningful as the great fables of India. In 1977, amateur archaeologist Anna Sofair climbed 400 143 treacherous feet up a butte in New Mexico's Chaco Canyon and discovered an ancient artifact of stunning importance: the Anasazi sun dagger. The sun dagger, at first glance a haphazard assemblage of rocks and spiral petroglyphs, tracked the sun's seasonal movements. Built to mark solar time, the sophisticated stone device indicates a staggeringly high level of geometric and astronomical skill among the Anasazi people. For the purposes of this study, during which we've had several occasions to comment on the creation of calendars, on geometry, and on astrology, there's a further remarkable fact. For in capturing the midday sun as a means of timekeeping, the Anasazi sun dagger is unusual among ancient astronomical tools. Most other such devices, including England's Stonehenge Observatory, detect the solstices by sighting the sun's position on the horizon at sunrise. In other words, the Anasazi placed special emphasis on the meridian sun, and this is interesting in light of our previous discussion. Recall that word, a synonym for longitude, which is so central to the Four Corners Monument story. We floated the remote possibility that meridian may be an alias for the Prince of Darkness, Lucifer, or Satan himself, who is occasionally said to appear more dazzling than the sun's meridian ray, and whose Route 666 highway was a fixture of the area until 2003. As an aside, Aleister Crowley's disciple, Kenneth Grant, asserted that the modern conception of Christianity's great adversary, Satan, derived from, or was a veiled reference to, the primordial Egyptian deity Set. You'll recall that among his other designations, Set was the god of deserts, which happened to dominate the American Southwest. In any event, the name Anasazi is a loanword from the Navajo language of Athabascan. In that tongue, the word means enemy ancestors, or enemy old ones. Were the Anasazi diabolical? What caused the collapse of the ancient empire of the Anasazi? What triggered the apparent disappearance of that entire race? These questions constitute what has been called the most perplexing mystery of American southwestern archaeology. During the 13th century, the Anasazi left their homeland, perhaps fleeing some intruder or escaping from famine or drought. The previously mentioned Tal Levesque hypothesized a much more calamitous scenario. According to him, the Anasazi had been violently destroyed in a vast catastrophe involving levels of heat attributable to thermonuclear explosions. The seemingly outlandish claim is, perhaps, made slightly less implausible by the Tunguska event on June the 30th, 1908, nearly 40 years before Oppie and Company concluded the Manhattan Project with a mushroom cloud. An unexplained occurrence leveled nearly 1,000 square miles of forest along the Tunguska River in what was then Imperial Russia. Sometimes called the Siberian Fireball, the incident has given rise to a number of proposed explanations, ranging from pedestrian scientific accounts, like that it was an airburst meteor, to undiluted science fiction, such as that the Earth was attacked by aliens using photon blasters. Among the surmises is that the devastation was caused by some bona fide nuclear device beyond the ken of quantum physicists. It's worth pointing out that according to the shadowy early 20th century alchemist known only as Fulcanelli, experts in the ancient Hermetic arts were supposedly capable of transmuting substances with incendiary effects, and quite apart from particle colliders or nuclear reactors. This line of speculation received a boost circa the 1980s when intelligence sources of unknown credibility circulated reports of the dangerous red mercury. The story goes that this mystery materiel, out of red, that is communist USSR no less, was the essential precursor to the kind of alchemical wizardry that could produce atomic bomb level effects. We bumped up against some of this in our past video, Top 10 Gold Making Alchemists. Of course, we'll also mention so-called cold fusion. The terminology owes to the Eisenhower-era Soviet-American nuclear arms race, although the concept of a near-room temperature nuclear fusion reaction goes back further. But, like the red mercury just mentioned, cold fusion was briefly publicized in the late 80s when two physicists claimed to have accomplished the feat. Be that as it may, until the 1990s, many, even most historians of the period, attributed the Anasazi's disappearance to the far more orthodox Great Drought of the 1200s. But changing perspectives in climatology have altered that picture. It's now believed that the relevant drought wasn't severe enough to explain why the Anasazi, who had been quite well adapted to desert life, suddenly and completely evacuated their elaborate settlements. For one thing, the Anasazi evidently started their departure before the drought even occurred. Moreover, some of their living sites were still being constructed in dry areas at the peak of the drought. Current thinking hypothesizes, quote, episodic settlement. The idea is that the Anasazi constructed dizzying cliff dwellings or huge settlements in the arid flatlands every few generations and then abandoned them as a snake might shed its skin. They kept building communities and deserting them, but the names by which the Indians were known changed. Thus, the Anasazi are thought to have migrated southeastward to join other Pueblo tribes. Today, the contemporary Hopi Indians are the presumed descendants of the Anasazi. They still have mesas near the center of the Four Corners area on the Colorado Plateau. And that area really matters. According to Indian legend, the nearby Black Mesa of Arizona is the literal heart of Mother Earth, which the Hopi have a sacred charge from the Great Spirit to preserve and protect. In the words of a true believer, for centuries the Hopi and other traditional American Indians have intuitively maintained a seasonal ceremonial cycle, providing the conscious harmony that is the essential factor to all land and life on the planet. During the 20th century, numerous curious ruins have been cataloged in the vicinity. To cite a single example, the confluence of the previously named Yellow Jacket and McElmo Canyons in southwestern Colorado and southeastern Utah, just a click north of the Four Corners, display great numbers of pictographs with many interesting symbols. Although the precise significance has been lost to time, these sprawling collections, described as engraved figures of ancient date, are undeniably striking. These and other finds enroll the Four Corners area on the list of American locales containing ostensibly inexplicable archaeological oddities. For example, just what is one to make of gold tablets bearing indecipherable characters? By standard historical accounting, these shouldn't have been found in Utah. Yet, according to Berry Fell student and collector William Bill McGlone, that's exactly where they were unearthed. Even granting their genuineness, the jury's still out on whether they're of a piece with artifacts such as the Kensington runestone or legends along the lines of the fabled plates of Mormon founder Joseph Smith, which he claimed to have encountered on Cumorah Hill in Palmyra, New York. Then there's the fascinating Indian buildings themselves, the Pueblos. Yellow Jacket Canyon, for instance, has a promontory with remarkable dwellings composed of slabs of stone set on edge, and this is to say nothing of the more dramatic constructions such as at Mesa Verde. These prompted longtime Four Corners resident, newspaper editor, and local politician Ian Thompson to ask, in his 1993 book, The Towers of Hovenweep, why are such structures seemingly unique to this area? Were the choices merely matters of expedience, given the availability of building materials, or is there another, possibly religious dimension? Without question, the spiritual life of the Anasazi centered on sunken, circular chambers called kivas, which symbolize the womb of Mother Earth, and thus the spiritual origins of the people. In the kivas, the spirits of the earth were invited out to bless the people. The mythical emergence of the Anasazi's ancestors was commemorated as a small hole on the kiva floor known as a sipapu. Tao Levesque made a lot of hay out of Indian traditions claiming emergence from the bowels of the earth. Fabled alchemy provides a point of contact by way of the ancient formula abbreviated VITRIOL, vitriol. This is frequently, if obscurely translated, visit the interior of the earth, and through purification you will find the hidden stone. For more, see Top 10 Gold-Making Alchemists. Levesque points out that the name La Nueva Mexico, or the New Mexico, refers both to a legendary warrior priest, later deified, as well as to the alleged belly button or navel of the moon, a close cousin, by the way, of a designation applied to Jerusalem by partisans of Judeo-Masonry. But that's another story. In any event, it's evident that New Mexico isn't called the land of enchantment for nothing. Of course, a variant Indian tale has it that their ancient forebears retreated into, rather than came out of, the earth, presumably to escape some nameless surface-level calamity. This is, by the way, a thread pulled on by the contemporary alchemical writers Jay Widener and Vincent Bridges in their 2003 Mysteries of the Great Cross of Henday, Alchemy and the End of Time. The duo discussed their theory that prehistoric humans fled cosmic radiation by entering secret caves in modern-day Peru, and that this history, along with directions to the escape route, is encoded in a stone cross found in the little town of Henday in southwestern France. For his part, Levesque posits that the Four Corners, with its network of as-yet unmapped caverns honeycombing the interior of the Colorado Plateau, might be yet another access point to some subterranean power realm. Levesque went on to cite self-professed UFO contactee George Hunt Williamson. Writing in 1961 under the pen name Brother Philip, Williamson's The Secret of the Andes forecast a future flood submerging the continental USA, except, that is, various mountain places on the east and west coasts, including, of course, the Four Corners. At least we're talking about potential, remarkable archaeological discoveries on the order of the sensational, and vehemently denied, temple, allegedly embedded in a cave complex in the walls of the Grand Canyon, or the verified underground Turkish cities, such as Derinkuyu and Kaymakla, one supposedly uncovered as recently as 1963. At the extremities, possibilities range as far out as anything retailed in the vast Hollow Earth literature. Of course, this extends from Edward Bulwer-Lytton's seminal 1871 novel Vril, which we discussed in the first installment of our multi-part series on Nazi occultism, through the 1881 treatise Oahspe, created in New Mexico no less, by the self-professed clairvoyant dentist John Newbrough as a product of automatic writing. But the Hollow Earth mythos spilled over onto various speculations about lost continents, like Atlantis and Lemuria, that emanated from such alleged adepts as Theosophical foundress Helena Petrovna H.P. Blavatsky, as well as fiction pioneer Howard Philip H.P. Lovecraft. And don't forget that celebrity medium and spiritualist Edgar Cayce suggested that the famed Great Sphinx of Egypt concealed its own ancient underground gateway. This one supposedly led to a hall of records left by Atlantean survivors. Cayce's retelling even implicated the fabulous Holy Grail, which we touched on in Part 2 of Nazi Occultists. Closer to our time, a lot of this was popularized by the quirky Richard Sharp Shaver and his energetic and imaginative publisher, Raymond A. Ray Palmer, who claimed, among other things, that the world was ruled by insane descendants of aliens living in a hollow earth. But these esoteric currents were probably most memorably and rivetingly dramatized by famed American novelist and short story writer Louis L'Amour in his 1987 science fiction western classic, The Haunted Mesa. Set amidst the ruins of the Anasazi, The Haunted Mesa imagines the remnants of Indian religious rooms, the kivas, as literal portals into the Mayan underworld of Xibalba, referred to in L'Amour's narrative as an alternate plane of existence he termed the Third World. In L'Amour's imagination, the Four Corners is pregnant with an almost mystical energy, and we surmise that this arises from or grows out of a history teeming with ancient Indian mysteries and overlaid with quasi-Masonic symbolism and numerology. It's tempting to conclude that Four Corners is a hotspot for more than geothermal aberrations and methane gas. As mentioned earlier, in a forthcoming video, we propose to further these investigations by exploring the parallel mythos surrounding another site in New Mexico. In that presentation, we intend to focus on Los Alamos National Laboratory, which became a literal nuclear hotspot on July 16, 1945. We'll raise the dark possibility that the Four Corners isn't the only purported magical gateway to the netherworld, so stay tuned.